Chapter 5. A separation of loving hearts, a specimen of Finnish composition, condescension and generosity. Sir Matthew clothes little Mchl with his own hands. While the superintendent, in his serpentine course homewards, scattered the tidings of his master's munificence towards the factory boy, Mchl Armstrong, and his mother, indulged themselves in a few parting words and very tender caresses, the mother continuing to repeat at intervals, "Be sure, darling, to be a good boy, and do what you're bid," while the son reiterated his entreaties that she and Teddy would take care of one another and have him back again, in spite of everything, if they found that they could not do so well without him. But even while this went on, Mchl was improving his toilet by putting on the more carefully patched garments which had hitherto been kept sacred for Sundays. When this operation was completed, and his hair, face, and hands made as clean as the joint efforts of himself and his mother could contrive to make them, the little boy turned to leave the miserable shed that had been his home, with a reluctant step and heavy heart, retracing the short distance between his mother's bed and the door, once again to take another kiss and to repeat, with increased earnestness, the questions, "Isn't there nothing more I can do for you, mother, before I go away? And will you be sure to tell Teddy to stop for me, morning and night, at the gate in the lane where it all happened? Will you, mother?" But at length the lingering separation was completed, and Mchl set off his return to Dowling Lodge. In the meantime, Sir Matthew himself had not been idle, but, retiring to his study, he composed a paragraph for the country newspaper, which, after considerable study and repeated correction, was at length completed, and dispatched by the post, in a feigned hand, the wax being stamped with the handle of the seal instead of his arms, and the postage paid. The paragraph ran thus: English benevolence. There is, perhaps, no class of men so cruelly misrepresented as the manufacturers of Great Britain, surrounded on all sides by a population of labourers, crowded together exactly in proportions to the quantity of work the neighbouring factories are able to furnish. They are continually reproached both with giving too many hours of employment to their poor neighbours on the one hand, and with the poverty which is inevitable the lot of the operatives with large families on the other. That all manufacturers, however, are not the cruel mercenary tyrants that they are so often and so unjustly described to be, was shown within the last few days by an incident which occurred near the town of Ashley, not 100 miles from DLG LDG. The owner of that splendid mansion, while escorting the amiable lady round his grounds, had occasion to remark some symptoms of a very noble disposition in one of the children belonging to a neighbouring factory on his estate. On making inquiries, he discovered him to be the son of a poor widow, whose failing health made her and her orphan children peculiarly eligible as objects of charity. This fact having been satisfactorily ascertained, Sir M.T. of Dowling gave way to the warm impulses of his generous heart, and adopting the little orphan among his own children, at once gratified the gentle feelings of his amiable nature, and set them an example which it is impossible they should ever forget. It is more easy for the recorder of this charming anecdote to relate thus the principal circumstances of it, than to enter into any detail of the numberless delicate traits of character exhibited by Sir M. in the course of the transaction. Those who know him thoroughly will, however, be at no loss how to supply these, and those who do not would scarcely understand a description where it were given with all the detail possible. The value and accuracy of this statement contained in this announcement belonged wholly to the author of it, the phraseology to a private manuscript digest of the newspaper Eloquence, the result of many years of steady research, during which no morsel of fine writing that might assist in such occasional addresses to the public as the present had been ever suffered to flow down the stream of time and perish without having been first carefully noted in the night's repertory of fine periods. Having concluded this business, Sir Matthew Dowling rang his bell. As it was only the study bell, it was answered, as usual, by one of the housemaids. Where is the little boy, my dear, that I sent into the servants' hall last night?" inquired Sir Matthew. "Upon my word, Sir Matthew, I can't tell," she replied, adding in that tone of familiar confidence which her master's condescension encouraged. "But if you sent him into the hall, Sir Matthew, he never got there, nor never will, you may take my word for it, as long as Madam Thompson reigns." The housemaid was not a beauty. None such as was before stated ever made part of Lady Dowling's household, but she was a wit, and Sir Matthew was too clever himself not to feel the value of cleverness in others. He, therefore, raised his eyebrows in a comic grimace, very good-humouredly chucked the maid under her ugly chin, and instead of putting himself into a rage, as might have happened under other circumstances, he only said, "How was that, my dear? Come, tell me all about it. I like your stories, Peggy. They are always so funny." "Whose stories wouldn't be funny, Sir Matthew, if they told of the airs and graces of Mother Thompson?" replied the lively damsel. "For she's all the world like an owl, as sits winking his eye and trying to look wise." "But she's a prime favourite with my lady, Peggy, and into the bargain knows a thing or two about soups and hashes, so we must be very respectful, my dear, in talking of her. But as to her daring to say that the boy I ordered into the hall was to be turned out of it, that's rather more than possible, I think." "That's because you don't know Miss Thompson, Sir Matthew. I only wish you had heard and seen 'em last night, she and the butler and Miss Fine Airs, my lady's maid, and Mr. Fine Airs, my lady's footman. It was not enough to make one sick. I wish I may never see I wish I may never see you again, Sir Matthew." "They are a confounded impertinent scent of rubbish," replied Sir Matthew, still without losing his good humour. "However, all people of fashion, that is, rich people, Peggy, always do have a confounded impertinent set of servants about 'em. That's one of the great differences between high people and low." "To be sure you must know best, Sir Matthew," replied the saucy grisette, but with a look and accent of somewhat ironical. "I don't mean to doubt that in the least, I'm sure, but in the places I've lived, Lord Wilmot's, Lord Crampton's, and such like, I never did hear my lord's commands being treated in that fashion. They might have their jokes in the hall, in the housekeeper's room too, no doubt of it, and impudent enough if you like it, but for downright flat disobedience, I never did hear of such a thing." Sir Matthew, on hearing this, became rather white about the lips and red about the forehead, but Peggy knew the rising storm was not at all likely to fall on her, so nothing daunted, she went on. "I don't think I should have taken much notice about it, Sir Matthew, if it hadn't been for not liking you to see you treated with disrespect, for I'm not over and above partial to beggar children myself, but that sort of natural dislike was nothing in comparison to my feelings about you, sir, and if I had been placed in power instead of having none, your will would have been obeyed, if every servant at the house had flowed for me." "You're an excellent girl," replied Peggy. "You're an excellent girl, Peggy," replied the knight, approaching her very condescendingly. "You know well enough that you are a favourite, and I know well enough, my dear, that you deserve to be so. And I'll tell you what, Peggy, I'll take care to let those animals, my servants, know that I am master here, as well as in the factory, and that my word's law." "And so it ought to be, Sir Matthew," replied the obedient domestic. "I hope I know my duty too well to dispute my master's will in anything." As she spoke very meekly, yielded herself to receiving the condescending salute with which Sir Matthew was pleased to reward her excellent sentiments. "You are an excellent good girl, Peggy," he resumed after a little interruption, "and don't fear but I shall find means to reward you. But you must give me your help, my dear, to confound the impertinence of these fellow servants of yours. If I don't make 'em wait upon that beggar's brat as if he were their lord and master, never trust me with a kiss more. Where's that little factory vermin, Peggy?" "I ain't able to answer you, Sir Matthew. All I know is that Mrs. Thompson marched us all out of the kitchen where she sat in judgment on him last night, and that he was left with the kitchen maid and the fat cook, but what's come of him since I am no ways able to say." On hearing this, Sir Matthew raised his hand towards the bell, but suddenly recollecting himself, he smiled and said, No, that won't do, Peggy, will it? Go, my dear, and ask where the boy is, and then come back and tell me." The damsel, in return, furtively smiled too, in acquiescence and approval of his discretion, and upon leaving his study for the purpose of prosecuting her inquiries among the servants, she encountered the object of them as he entered the back door on his return from visiting his mother's cottage. "So, here's where you are, then. Well, you must come along this minute to Sir Matthew," she said, addressing him somewhat gruffly, and not too well pleased, perhaps, at this interruption to the confidential conversation with her master, which it had been her purpose to renew. But to the ears of Mchl, the name of Sir Matthew was sufficient to render all other words indifferent, and conscious only that into his dreaded presence he must go if commanded to do so, he followed the girl with a beating heart, and in a few minutes stood pale and almost breathless before the awful countenance of the great man. Sir Matthew gazed at him for a moment with a sort of sneer, which, if interpreted skilfully, would have been found to address itself inwardly. Sir Matthew could not choose but sneer at the whimsical enragement of accidents, which had converted him into Mr. Allworthy. The sneer, however, as far as it concerned himself, had no mixture of contempt in it. Had another done this thing, he thought, should I not have called him fool? And is it not 99 chances to 100, and thereby I should have described him truly? May the same be said of me? No, by the living God, it may not. How now, little boy? You have made yourself smart, I see. Vastly fine. Indeed, an inch of clean dowlas, a piece of new-span green blades for a patch, a pair of bony legs without stockings, and magnificent shoes. I did not say a pair, Peggy, but very magnificent shoes. One, I suppose, won in battle from a giant, and the other from a dwarf. Fine as a prince, isn't he, Peggy? As he thus jeered the little fellow, his eyes wandered with malignant jocularity over his person, which was, in truth, the very model of makeshift poverty, while the child, as if he felt the eye palpably crawling like a reptile over him, shuddered, he knew not why. Then, changing his tone so suddenly as to make even the confiding Peggy start, he continued, "You horrid lump of rags, stand back, stand back, stand back, back, behind that high chair, do you hear? Stand close and stand still. If he does not make me sick as a dog, Peggy, let me never smell musk no more." "He does smell horrid bad, to be sure, Sir Matthew," replied the girl. "Hadn't I better take him back to Molly, the kitchen maid, and make her scour him?" "No, hang him. That won't take it out of him. I know 'em all. No, Peggy, let the scouring alone. Just go upstairs to the nursery maids, and tell them to send me down a good handsome suit of clothes, complete, of Master Dusselmet's. He's the nearest in size to this Scaramouche, and I will dress him, Peggy, as if he were the son of the Duke. It will be fun, capital fun. Will it not be generous, Peggy?" "Generous, Sir Matthew? It will be past all belief. What? Him to be dressed up in the clothes of Master Dudamus? Oh my, Sir Matthew, you must surely be joking." "I'm as serious as an undertaker, girl. Get along with you, and do what I bid you. The longer you're about it, mind, the longer I shall have to sit in the same room with this ragamuffin in his own full dress. So make haste, if you please." This was said in a manner to remove all doubts as to the munificent knight's being in earnest, and the active Peggy went and returned with as little delay as was consistent with necessity she felt herself under, of entering into some short explanation with the nursery ladies, one and all of whom seemed much inclined, on the first opening of her mission, to treat the whole business as a hoax. When at length, however, she had succeeded in making it apparent that Sir Matthew was waiting for the suit of clothes in a most monstrous, outrageous passion of a hurry, the messenger's arms were speedily loaded in exact conformity to the orders she had brought, and she returned to the knight's study with all that was needed to convert the rude exterior of little Mchl into the nearest resemblance that nature would permit to the elegant and accomplished Master Duodecimus. Considering the loathing and disgust manifest by Sir Matthew towards the person and the poverty of his protege, it was extraordinary to see the amusement he seemed to derive from dressing him up. Though the alert and obedient Peggy stood close by to do his pleasure, it was his own large hands that thrust the little limbs of Mchl into the clothing he chose they should wear, and it was amidst shouts of laughter from both that the ludicrous metamorphosis was completed. But somehow or the other, when they had finished their masquerading work, the result was not altogether what Sir Matthew anticipated. The clothes were very handsome, well-made clothes, and as poor Michael, notwithstanding his leanness, was a very handsome and well-made boy, the incongruity between them seemed to vanish in the most unaccountable manner as the operation drew towards a conclusion. Peggy, however, was not such a fool as not to understand that what was expected of her, so when the knight, catching up his son's tasseled cap, pressed it down upon the little curly head, as a lusty packer of worthless goods thrusts down the cover that is to enclose them, and then pushed the child towards her with an impulse that nearly brought him up upon his nose, she very judiciously renewed her noisy laughter, exclaiming, "Did you ever once see such a little quiz?" "Quiz, girl?" replied Sir Matthew, eyeing him with no fond expression. "It would be well for the scamp if he knew if it would be well for the scamp if that was the worst you could say of him. I know a thing or two, Peggy, and that boy will be lucky if he gets drowned. I bet 100 guineas that, with a few lessons, he would forge any writing you could show him, and before he is 20 he will have taken as many shapes as Turpin. That boy was born with a halter round his neck. I want no gypsy to tell me that." During the whole of the undressing and redressing operations, the boy's cheeks had been dyed with blushes, and his eyes so fixedly nailed to the floor that neither Sir Matthew nor his maid had been able to enjoy their embarrassed expression. But as this dark prophecy fell on him, he looked up, and it was well for him that his munificent patron at the same instant turned his mocking glances towards the servant, as he said, "There, gather up his rags, girl, and be sure you wash well after it," for he had met that speaking young eye, and could hardly have misunderstood the scorn that shot from it. As it was, however, he saw nothing but the patched garments that were scattered round, and once more sneering as he looked at them, he added, "Lead the little blackguard through the servants' hall, and into Mrs. Thompson's parlour. Do you hear, Peggy? Up to her very nose, and tell her that I have sent him to pay her a visit, and when she has enough of the compliment, lead him round to Mademoiselle's room, and we'll have a little fun amongst the children." By no means displeased with an errand which permitted her to affront with impunity the autocrat of all offices, Peggy gathered together Michael's discarded wardrobe, and then, clutching hold of his hand, led him, bon gré mal gré, to the presence of the imperious housekeeper. Mrs. Willis, my Lady Dowling's own maid, and Mr. Jennings, my Lady Dowling's own man, were enjoying with that important functionary a slight morning repast of fruit, cakes, and wine, and at the moment Peggy and her charge entered, they were enjoying some very excellent jokes together. But Mr. Jennings no sooner cast his eye on the little factory boy than he arose, looking rather abashed at being caught by a drawing-room guest of even 9 years old, with a glass of claret in one hand and a slice of pineapple in the other. Peggy, to whom the conciliatory smiles of this gay gentleman did not descend, enjoyed his mystification exceedingly, and relaxing her rough hold of Michael's wrist, she led him respectfully towards the table, saying, "My master has sent this young gentleman to pay a visit, Mrs. Thompson. Perhaps he would like a little fruit. There, my dear, that's the housekeeper Sir Matthew told you of, and it will please you to go and sit down by her. I dare say she will give you something nice." Mr. Jennings immediately placed a chair beside the gracious Mrs. Thompson, who, after filling and setting before the young gentleman a plate with whatever she supposed to be the most agreeable, said in a half whisper to his conductor, "Who is it, Peggy? I didn't never hear a carriage." Before she could, or at least before she would answer, Michael, who had not accepted the chair offered to him, took his cap from his head, and with considerable more courage than he had yet shown, said, "I am Michael Armstrong, the factory boy." "Who? What?" screamed the housekeeper. "What bold joke is this, Peggy Perkins? Do you think you've gotten a patent for your place, that you dare play such tricks as this?" "If I keep my place, I don't think I have to thank you for it, madam," replied the favoured housemaid with very little civility. "My master ordered me to bring the boy to pay you a visit. Those were his very words, Mrs. Thompson, and as I was bid, so have I done." "There's some people will do everything that and anything they are bid," observed Mrs. Willis, again drawing out her favourite smelling bottle, while the other she extended a wine glass to Mr. Jennings for a little Madeira, which she felt was absolutely necessary to support her in this very disagreeable emergency. Master Sir Matthew Dowling doesn't know how to behave himself. It's as I says it. I don't care who repeats it to him." Mr. Jennings stared at the factory boy for a full minute very attentively, and then gave a very long, low whistle, at the same time turning his eyes with a look of intelligence full in the face of the housekeeper. "He isn't like any of 'em, Miss Thompson," he said. Miss Thompson shook her head. "There is nothing at all in that, Mr. Jennings, I'm sorry to say, but I remember I do desire and insist that the subject never alluded in my presence again. When I lived with his grace, I always make it a rule that none of the household should ever discourse in my presence of anything that is not decent to hear." "Well, madam," said Peggy, "when you have done looking at him, he is to go into Mchl's room for the children to see him." The housekeeper, the lady's maid, and the footman all simultaneously lifted up their hands and eyes to heaven. "Please let me put on my old clothes and go home," said Michael. "You ungrateful little wretch!" exclaimed Peggy. "When Sir Matthew dressed you up himself with his own hands. What do you mean by that, you bad boy?" "They'll laugh at me," said Michael resolutely, "and I don't like it." "You don't? That's a good one," said Mr. Jennings, clapping his hands in ecstasy. "Oh, Lord, pray let us have him back again, Mrs. Peggy. That is to say, if Sir Matthew can bear to part with him. He's the finest fun I've got sight of in this many a day." You must find fun for yourself, Mr. Jennings. I shan't be at trouble of bringing you none," replied the self-satisfied Peggy, again seizing the hand of Michael and leading him off. "Well, for a broom maid, I hope she's saucy enough," said Mr. Jennings, but the subject of his remark was already beyond hearing, threading her way through the long stone passages which conducted to the opposite wing of the mansion, the whole of which was appropriated to the younger branches of the Dowling family.